Today we'll be talking about a poet who is named Edward Estlin Cummings, or more formally known as E.E. Cummings. He was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to Edward and Rebecca Cummings on 1894, October 13th. At a very early age, Edward's mother, Rebecca, introduced him to poetry. At the age of 8, he began working on a poem every single day, improving on it and changing the style until he was 20. Rise and shine. His father was a professor at Harvard University who was teaching modern English, and he also Edward had a sister named Elizabeth who didn't matter. But you know what did matter? His mother and father loved him very much and encouraged him to continue to develop his gifts because they realized what potential they had for his future life. Finally, in 1916, Cummings earned his Master of Art and Bachelor of Art from Harvard in 1916. After getting his degree, Cummings worked on innovating modern art and had a job at a mail catalog company. I know, crazy, you actually had to mail stuff back then. And then after doing about 6 months of military camp after being drafted, since, World War I happened or something, he went to study art in Paris. So, during World War I, the French had a kind of totalitarian government. And Mr. Cummings didn't like this at all. He wrote these cool letters to his friends in U.S., and they were very suspicious, some would say, hinting at things of him trying to organize an activist group against the government. And then the French were all like,
"Oh, you do not like the government? Go to the jail!"
And then they put him into a big room with a bunch of other jailmates, and then the room was so big and he must have got really bored. He wrote a whole book about it. And this book was called, wait for it, The Enormous Room. I know, really putting that Bachelor of Arts to use. So, after he was put in the room, his dad whined a lot to the French government, and they were like, alright, just let him out, this guy's getting annoying. So after he got out, he wrote this cool collection of poems called Tulips and Chimneys. He was influenced by some other cool poets at the time, like Amy Lowell and Gertrude Stein, who were using imagistic experiments. At first, people thought that his poetry sucked and that it wasn't very popular at all, and
Oh my god, this sucks!
And he actually needed to pay the publishers to publish it, and but this cool magazine called The Dial thought, hey, this guy's pretty cool, and gave him $2,000, which in today's money would be like $27,000, so it's pretty, making big money. So that was like a yearly sum for him, so it really helped him focus on poetry. His style was very unique and broke a lot of rules, like using nouns as verbs and verbs as nouns. It was crazy. While his style was very unique, it mostly didn't change at all, and throughout his life it was mostly repetitive. But his favorite poems were love poems, satirical squibs, and descriptive nature poems focused on love, sexuality, and nature. In 1926, he traveled around the world, writing poems at night and painting in day. And finally, in 1931, he published a collection of drawings and paintings that were called Chiopua, or CIOPW, which were named after materials he used, like ink, oil, pencil, watercolor, and charcoal. E.E. Cummings had a rough love life, having 3 marriages until his happy one with Marion Morehouse. And he went in between New York and Paris most of the time, where Paris he further studied art. In 1945, poets became more rebellious against the previous generation, and they changed their style and now saw his work as amazing.
Wow, this is amazing!
I know, right? And after about 1,000 poems, finally, in 1942, he died of a stroke. in New Hampshire. I know, in the hospital of all places, and that's where this story finally ends. Hello, and welcome to the poetry section of this video, where we will be talking about the Pretty How Town by E.E. Cummings. And it starts like this. Anyone lived in a pretty how town, with up so floating many bells down. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, he sang his din, he danced his did. So, we're starting with a character named Anyone, and Anyone lived in a little town, but not just any town, a little how town. That'll be important for later. The bells that Anyone sees are symbolism of celebrations of things like weddings that Anyone looks forward to, but is too small to get to right now, because he's young. His height represents his age. The spring, autumn, summer, winter shows the passage of time while Anyone goes through life, showing the cycle of nature, always going, while he goes through his busy life. And saying he danced his dids and sang his didn'ts is saying how he talked about what he wanted to do and what he hasn't done, but what he's dancing and celebrating about what he has done in life, so generally enjoying life. Women and men, both little and small, cared for anyone, not at all. They sowed their isn't, they reaped their same. Sun, moon, stars, rain. This shows how people in this little how town didn't really care about this character that we have called Anyone. They didn't really care about him. They only cared about themselves. And they also sowed, meaning they raised their children. They were all different to begin with, but when it says reaped their same, talks about how they all end up the same, like all the other children. And the sun, moon, stars, rain tells, once again, the author is reinforcing the fact that the nature continues on, no matter the busy lives that we think we're leading. We continue. Children guessed, but only a few, and down they forgot as up they grew. Autumn, winter, spring, summer, that no one loved him more and more. Now we see that the children start to look at this other person called No One. I know, a person named No One and a person named Anyone, it's a little confusing. And think that no one loves anyone, but as they grow up, like their parents, stop caring about the people around them, and generally just forget that she did like him. And also we once again see the passage of time through the seasons, and we can see that no one loves him, which we assume is Anyone, and no one starts to like him more and more. When by now and tree by leaf, she laughed his joy, she cried his grief. Bird by snow, and stir by still. Anyone's any was all to her. So, when by now means sometime in anyone's life, so we're being told about an experience of his, and the leaf is an experience, and the tree is his life, so his life is made up of many experiences, or leaves. And so we're talking about a time in his life, and she, who is no one, laughed his joy and cried his grief, shows a growing connection between the two people. And when it says the birds and the snow, the bird stands out of a picture of snow, and the stirring and idleness stands for how no matter what was happening in life, no one's anyone always stood out to her, showing his importance to her. Basically, he was a big thing in her life and always stood out to her. And the last line of the poem, for anything that anyone cared about, became also extremely important to no one. So basically, they got this growing connection between them. So the love is beginning to fruition. Someone's married their everyone's, laughed their cryings, and did their dance. Sleep, wake, hope, and then they said their nevers, and they slept their dream. Someone, being anyone, marries their others, or their everyone, since a person thinks that the person that they are marrying is the most important person to them in the world, they are their everyone's. So, by them saying they cried and laughed and danced, is basically their weddings. And because there's so many emotions going on. And then the talks sleep, wake, hope, and then is basically talking about them going through life and until they're old. And by saying they said their nevers and slept their dream is talking about everyone, how they go through life, and eventually when they get old they say what they can't do anymore, their nevers. I'll never be able to walk again and I'll always be in this wheelchair. And slept their dream refers to death and talking about the eternal sleep and dreaming. Stars, rain, sun, moon, and only the snow can begin to explain how children are apt to forget to remember, with up so floating many bells down. Even as people change, get old, and live their lives, they see nature continues on, not changing or caring at all what happens in our lives. Snow being death, with snow causing numb, cold unmoving, like anyone who is dead, and shows how if the children care about other people, they will die anyway, even if they care or not. One day, anyone died, I guess, and no one stooped to kiss his face. Busy folk buried them side by side, little by little, and was by was. We find out that our great guy, anyone, dies finally. But people don't really care by adding "I guess" to the end. But except no one, anyone was no one's everyone, because they cared so much, and everyone else doesn't really care. So even if someone is the most important thing in your life, they can be absolutely nothing to another person, and it just shows how little one person can be in the whole universe. And when they eventually both die together, them being buried side by side, slowly as the busy folk bury them, and slowly forget them, as by the poem saying "was by was," becoming like existing and slowly fading away until they eventually forget about them. Busy folk, and all by all, and deep by deep, and more by more, they dream their sleep. No one and anyone, earth by April, wish by spirit, and if by yes. No one and anyone lie in the ground dead, as all by all and deep by deep explains further how they're being buried, finally, into the ground, and they were buried in April, by saying they're in April, so it's spring, and they wished for things but never got to do them. And men and women, both dong and ding, summer, autumn, winter, spring, reaped their sowing and went their came, stars, sun, moon, stars, rain. The people start and end their lives as we hear the ringing of bells as weddings and funerals happen. All the time, nature continues as people come and go, ultimately becoming unimportant as they live and die, as nature continues and time passes on. In the pretty How town, talks about how life goes on as the town is a symbol for the cycle of life between a man and a woman, and how they eventually die and it keeps repeating. But nature, and they think that everything changes as they grow old, but nature continues and doesn't stop. So thank you very much for listening to my poem, and that is all from our man, Mr. Cummings.